Hi, y'all. Name is Forrest. I am the founder and director of Democratic Design and Engagement with the Assembly Project. We're going to talk about the New York context a bit, deliberation in New York, and what we have been doing and where we're going with it. But I first want to start off with an image. Depending on who you are in the audience or where you come from, it may conjure up a few different ideas. It might be us versus them. It might be security. It might be a hegemonic power structure. But for me, this is home. I grew up in South Texas, along the Texas-Mexico border, and these narratives were constant growing up. All along being a young person, it essentially accumulated to get educated and get out. You don't need to be here. There's better places to be. So I listened. I went up to Austin, went to school, spent a few years there, and traveled outside the US after that, broadened my horizons, all the good stuff. But I came back home. I found a job back in South Texas. And when I got back, I was extremely depressed. I was sad, I was a bit angry. I thought I had failed, that I came back to this community where that was the narrative, that I was a failure. I realized with some good friends that that's just a cultural narrative that I was brought up in, and that you can do something to be a part of a larger community, to connect to what's actually happening on large-scale issues, and that could help you connect to actually finding some grounding in the home that you're from. So I worked on food insecurity issues. I did a lot of participatory design work, and ended up changing the narrative for myself about where I live and to a place I really love. And I say this all because I think it's really important for us to know our whys. And for me, it was being able to connect to something that's larger than myself, to be able to affect systems that are typically out of my control, to be able to work on large-scale initiatives, whether it's food insecurity, whether it was immigration. These help me connect to being who I am and finding love in the place that I'm going. And with that being said, I go back and I think about it, and I really wish that I had had that understanding younger. I wish that as a young person in high school and middle school, I was also thinking about these things, but they were just so distant to you. I was in school. But that doesn't have to be the case. Right here is a picture of a young boy in a school in Bolivia. And you'll see that he has a red bean in his hand, and there's a little pot that's covered, and he pulled out the red bean, but there's a lot of white beans you see here. What this signifies is that by picking the red bean, he was randomly selected to be on his student government. So for the next year, he is going to be a representative of his student government. He may not have ever thought to be in student government. I never would have thought to be in student government. But as they showed, is randomly selecting and democratizing leadership for young people. It's allowed them to grow leadership skills. It allowed them to engage in a different way than maybe orthodox sit down, listen to the teacher type of schooling wasn't going to do for them. And so I think that we have a real opportunity when we're thinking about democratic innovations, when we're thinking about how we move forward with our society, but we shouldn't just always think about how do we change government, or government in what we know as our municipalities, federal and state government. But what about governance? What about the governance systems that our students are in? What about other ways that we can democratically engage at the same time as looking at those larger systems? What would happen if there was a bottom-up movement for a paradigm shift of democracy? And so I want to share this really quick, that I think this is kind of like a through line through a lot of what I'll talk about today and some of the initiatives that we're doing. It's from Dennis Meadows. He was the co-author of Limits to Growth. But I'll read it nice and slowly so everybody can hear it. Models are implemented not because the results convince somebody else, but because somebody participates in the process, educates themselves through that process, and then comes to understand reality differently. It's not just that we come up with good recommendations or that an assembly comes up with good recommendations. the pathway forward, a collective pathway forward, comes through the actual process of learning together, of deliberating, of deciding. And so what I want to talk about today is an overview of the assembly project, or TAP. I'll be using that a lot for short. A bit of deliberative democracy. This morning we've already had a good overview of that. I might add a few tidbits to that, skip over some other things with some of the case studies. But then we'll talk about lessons learned and what that means for models moving forward and what we're doing in New York City. So just a quick overview. The Assembly Project is a movement for a more expansive and collaborative democratic system. What does that mean and how do we do that? We have a three-pronged strategy. One, it's yes, we can design and help advocate for deliberative processes. I was helping out the New York City Civic Engagement Commission. They have been doing participatory budgeting in the council district since 2011, but in 2018, by a democratic charter, the Civic Engagement Commission was put into office, and they have the mandate of doing citywide participatory budgeting. They came to a conference that Phil Lindsay, participant and is going to be on the panel here, hosted and got really interested in deliberation and wanted to merge the worlds. So we joined and we helped to design a process that was both participatory budgeting but also had deliberative components in it. A lot of chatter going on here, but I think that's a good thing when we're talking about students in a classroom. What they're doing right now is working on they're going through a simulation of an assembly. Very short, fast, but how do you collaboratively come up with different policies? And this was done at the New School. I'm gonna be teaching there in the spring, a course called Design for Democracy, in partnership with People Powered, a colleague of mine, Mariana Gonzalez. So we create these co-curricular activations. I say activations because it's not just for the classroom, but other spaces where we can learn, in museums, in libraries, in ways that we can activate the public in learning, not just in the classroom. And then lastly, it's galvanizing a collaborative civic ecosystem. And this will culminate at the end of my talk and what that actually looks like for us. We've developed a model which is a collective effort through many of the practitioners in the field. I will not take full credit of that at all, but it is something that many people have been working on, and I'll go over some of those collaborators a bit later. So those are the three. I'm gonna start now. Just really quick clarifiers. I also have other affiliations, so I'm with the Assembly Project, but I work with CUNY, or the City University of New York, in a newly established climate justice hub, and we'll be doing a resiliency participatory budgeting process there. And I do want to give a big shout out also to Phil again. He is a huge collaborator in helping to build this deliberative ecosystem in New York. Over the past few years, we have partnered in so many different ways. And we just organized a conference just a few weeks ago that was really successful, had a bunch of folks there. So I throw it out there for anybody that wants to come next year. We please invite you to come. But yeah, let's go quickly over deliberative democracy. So I know this is going to be a simplistic depiction, but a lot of times I'm introducing deliberative democracy to people that have no idea I ever heard it before. So I know that deliberative democracy is not as simplistic as this, but it helps to get the ideas in people's minds. If we looked on the left, representative democracy can be on one end of the spectrum, where we are electing our politicians. On the far end, we can go to a direct democracy where every decision was made by all of us. We would get updates on our phones about little decisions that needed to be made in government. We all collectively made those decisions through votes. That sounds dystopian for me. I wouldn't want to do that. That sounds like way too much to be able to always have to make every single decision. But there's somewhere in the middle, and that's where deliberative democracy or civic assemblies can come in. Now, again, I know that in the literature there is some thoughts that deliberative democracy is also expansive to the maxi public, and it's actually, there's critiques on it just being within the mini publics. Totally understand that. Again, this is a simple way to communicate the idea. Three components, and I call these civic assemblies. I want to actually make a point of that. In New York and just in the US, citizen, I think, is going to be contentious in some political areas to be able to call that, because we think of it so much as documentation of being a part of a citizen. So civic assembly is one that I've used. Other people have used people's assemblies, but sometimes that has different connotations. So know that if I say civic assembly, I mean what has been popularized as a citizens' assembly elsewhere. But there's three components. We've already talked about lotteries or representative selections. We go into the assembly phase, which ideally is around 30 to 90 hours of meeting time, and then policies that go into policies for legislation. Very simplified. We'll get a bit more complex later. But looking at representative selection, we've already talked about this. The history comes from Greece and Athens, using the clariterion to be able to select different folks. And through lots, you'll see the little marbles going down. The white marble means that lot gets selected. But on the left, it's also, this process has been used in many indigenous and other forms in the past. So the Kura Olai system was in Tamil India, and how that would work is that everybody that wanted to be on a decision-making council for a specific issue would write their name on a palm leaf, and they would put it in a jar where one of the children from the community would come and select 20 or 30 names. Those individuals would then go out and make decisions on it. So again, this is not just a Western collective decision-making thing that now is getting popularized because of Western power structures, but it has been around for a while. But what would that look like in New York City to actually make it tangible? Looking at who would be in the room if we had a city-wide citizens' assembly or civic assembly in New York, 68% would come from an ethnically diverse population, 50% would come from households earning less than $67,000 a year, which in New York is not very much at all. These are households, not individuals. And lastly, speaking a language other than English at home, 48% of the individuals in the assembly would look like that. So very diverse assembly. A lot of different opinions would have a space for those opinions. Yes? These are, we pulled these from census data. This, it's not the exact criteria that has happened in a New York City citizens assembly, but when making the argument for one and trying to demonstrate who would be in the room, this is what we pull from, yeah. And so we know about in the civic assembly, it's not just the participants. Experts are able to speak at the civic assemblies. Advocates and stakeholders, making sure that people that are affected by a specific issue have a space to also speak about this. And then small group facilitators. Key and important that there is some moderation on that so conversations are constructive and difficulties are managed. And obviously, we already said there's a deliberative wave. There's been around over 6,000 assemblies. I think it was like 500 when it first, a couple of years ago. There's been a lot more since then. I'm going to just share 3 case studies very quickly. So the first one, we talked a little bit about the Irish Constitutional Convention. One of the things that they were deciding on was same-sex marriage. Now, there's I wrote these people's names down. I think one is Chris and the other one I'm forgetting his other name. But here on the left, this man is a postal worker from rural Ireland. And he never thought he wanted to be in assembly. It was kind of like not pushed into it, but finally was convinced to be a part of this assembly. Chris is more from the city. He is a gay man, and he was really questioning whether his life in Ireland will continue to, if he will continue to stay in Ireland because of the political implications of same-sex marriage not being passed. They were at the same table. They both kind of identified that they were very pessimistic about being here. But over months and months and having beers with each other and hanging out, they actually shared that they had a lot more in common. And in the very end, the man on the left, on one of the final assemblies, stood up and said, I truly believe that we need to give people the ability to be married no matter who they are. And coming from his perspective and that political shift was very powerful to the room. So this is a story and a narrative that's really useful when describing the power of these and the paradigmatic shift that they can have. Some of you may know there was a Michigan citizens panel on COVID that happened during the pandemic. And I'm actually not going to speak to this because I'm going to allow you to listen to it. So here's just a bit of a clip.
I'm not quite the proponent of the mask because I haven't seen it.
Our freedoms are getting taken away.
We're not being precautious enough.
There has to be help or there won't be anything left.
The words are called personal responsibility.
How do you get somebody to step into somebody else's shoes to care for 1 minute?
I hadn't thought that there were other perspectives that I hadn't taken into account.
To lose 3 family members in the space of 8 months is just beyond comprehension.
I just think I need to learn a little more about this. Maybe get an understanding of what people have dealt with and try to move forward the best we can.
I feel like there's a lot of respect going around.
We're all trying really hard to do our best for everyone.
This was bigger than COVID. What we did over 6 weeks is unlike anything I've ever seen.
People from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different political views, and we could all come together and say, we are aligned with these policies.
I'm going to have to exit for a second to get out of here. Sorry about that, y'all. It did this last time. Alrighty. So yeah, just a quick update about that. There's 12 policy proposals, 70 to 90% agreement on those specific policy proposals. There's a final report, which I've actually had a lot of trouble fishing up now. I think they've changed the website, so I would happily give you that link, but the final report has been difficult for me to even fish up. But eventually they'll probably put it back up on their site. And the last one I want to go a bit more detail is the New York City deliberative participatory budgeting process that we worked on. So just as a quick overview, participatory budgeting is different than citizens' assemblies. There can be a lot of carryover and a lot of overlap, but they can also be very different. The origins of participatory budgeting, it started in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 1989, and it was an anti-poverty measure. And exactly, it's a democratic process. Communities come together and they decide how to spend part of their budget. A lot of it is actually not defined in the sense of who can be there, how much. It's a lot more open to how the field wants to interpret it. But these have been happening all over the world. There's been over 11,600 of them that's been have been carried through by municipalities. When combining these two, it's important to actually distinguish the difference between them. So this is actually taken from New Democracy and formatted in a way for more condensed. They had a whole paper on this, but I condensed it down to breadth and depth, the difference between participatory and deliberative processes. And we're going to use 2 different examples because both of these were actually used in this whole deliberative participatory budgeting process. So first, there was 12,000 residents that were able to give their ideas, and they could submit them online. They could go to idea generation sessions. A high amount of people could go to those. Comparatively to an assembly, only about maybe 15 to 500 people can go to an assembly-ish. And then when we're looking at participant selection, we had anybody can go and submit an idea. But when we did the assembly committees, that was stratified selection based on random selection. And it was a volunteer lottery. We'll go into the difference between those and a lottery that we know about in most of the processes that have happened, but a small difference there. And then finally, the type of participation. Participation is more about voicing your ideas and opinions, where deliberation is more deeply discussing the issues and making informed judgments together collectively. So not just the idea that you have now, but what you're coming to as a realization after the process. So we did the idea generation phase. That looked like 82 community organizations doing work, over 523 workshops to get over 2,000 ideas that were submitted. That then led to the actual borough assembly committees, where there's a borough assembly committee in each of the boroughs. So in New York City, there's the Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. 20 participants were selected, but about 16 to 15 were there at each assembly. They had only about 12 to 14 hours. So when going in there, I was like, oh, we need at least this amount of time. Obviously, this is a new idea for city government, so there was a bit of pushback, and also like budgeting constraints. So we ended up kind of finding an even ground at about 12 to 14 hours. At the end of the process, each committee went from 100 ideas, and each borough, they had about 100 ideas, and they came down to the top 4 to 15 ideas for a ballot that then would go citywide for everybody to be able to vote on. Our demographic factors for this one, we used race and ethnicity, age, educational attainment, household income, and then also targeted communities. So what I mean by that, we were trying to make sure that we included at least one representative from in each committee that was a new English language learner, a veteran, a person with disabilities, person in public housing, justice impacted residents, and Native American or Native Hawaiians. So trying to, as best as we could, to include one person that also had those. If we're talking about identities, everybody has a multitude of different identities, so it wasn't just like one or the other. But that is something that we strove for within this process. And if you're curious, we used census data from, I believe it was 2019, because we were nervous that 2020 had, its own political implications with not as many respondents and that not being as accurate. This is a quick roadmap that we use for the process. So the first one is an introduction and relationship building day. People getting to know each other. What are their subcommittees? Who's in them? What is this process? Second one, they actually break into their subcommittees, look at all these ideas, start to narrow them down, but also ask questions around key information that they need to be able to make an informed decision. We came back with them with that, some of this information that they were able to sift through and discuss and be able to understand the implications of the different questions that they had, and then narrow those down in the third session. The fourth session, they came back with more implementation type of information, because now it was narrowed enough to where we can find implementation examples so that they can look at a specific project. So for example, if there was a project that wanted to be an after-school arts program, and specifically, for self-defense, we would look up and find people that were doing this type of work, what they would normally charge, how many people this could impact, try to give this type of data so people can make an informed decision if this is the type of initiative that they want to fund with this money. I am going to just do a quick time check. I think I will actually not go through too much of this. I actually don't think I'll go through this video. It's a nice video. It really speaks about the process a bit. It's a storytelling video, but I want to kind of get to some of the other stuff that we have in this presentation. Quickly, a pre and post survey. I know y'all are going to love some stats, but very the belief that the CEC, or the Civic Engagement Commission, is very trustworthy increased by 25%, totaling at 80% after this process. That was in a pre and post survey. And secondly, motivation to be highly or often engaged in government decisions that affect their lives increased by 46%, totaling at 86%. Now, I want to make sure that there's a difference. The pre and post survey, about 95% of the participants did. A follow-up survey was an emailed survey. So we got about, I think, 45 or so percent. So difference in the numbers below. But of the email survey, 90% said they would serve on this again. 90% said they would recommend this to a friend or family. 87% said the process expanded their awareness of important issues. And 50% said that their opinions and perspective had changed on which issues should be addressed. I'm also not going to go, if you really want to nerd out and look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of both participatory and deliberative processes, there's a paper on Medium that I wrote that the Civic Engagement Commission just published. Happy to share that if you'd like to look at it more. That just goes through a lot of these details. But I do want to talk about now lessons learned that the Assembly Project, that this ecosystem has been thinking about when it comes to assemblies. Now, before going in there, Philip and I from the Democracy Innovation Hub, we did a bit of a tour around Milan, Brussels, and Paris this past summer. All three of these cities have permanent assembly models. I believe actually Brussels, it's on someone corrected me last night, Belgium level, so on the national level. But there's so much going on in each one of these ecosystems and what they're doing with deliberation. So we got to meet a lot of people that were working on this and really try to learn some of the best practices that you don't just get to see in the research papers. And some of the things, and from that, and also from our own experience, some of the conclusions that we've come to is that assembly should be relatively focused. They're having a really large, broad remit. I think I think it can be done, but a lot of times I think it creates. It could be a bit broad for the residents. It also leads to a lot of recommendations that might be too broad to actually do something with in policy recommendations. And then also, if just like I don't think this is the only reason, but in the French Climate Assembly, if you get 149 recommendations that were pretty radical, what is it? That's a lot of big change that's going to happen for a government to have to deal with, right? So why don't we narrow these down, do more of these assemblies, but narrow them down so they're a bit more specific. And they should have sufficient time. The French end-of-life assembly had 90 hours. It's kind of the gold standard now. Next thing we've learned is that bottom-up movements can lead to expansive assembly ecosystems, so not just coming from government. If we look at Belgium, the reason why deliberation has kind of resurfaced throughout Europe was because after 2 years without a functioning government, the G1000 was established as a form of participatory deliberation and policy making. And that has led to their ecosystem being expansive. Same thing with France. The French Climate Assembly only happened after President Macron introduced a tax on fuel as well as speed limit. He introduced it, it wasn't put into policy yet, and the Yellow Vest movement arose because that was going to affect working class citizens the most, and this was supposed to be a climate policy, supposed to help with the mitigation of climate change. However, it was who is it going to impact those policies? And so they were upset that it was affecting them most. He threw his hands up and said, maybe I'll allow you to decide. More to that, obviously, but in both of these areas, there's a lot of different assemblies and deliberative processes happening on municipality levels, state, federal, etc. Third thing that we've learned is to ensure that there's an impact, there needs to be a connective tissue. It can't just be the assembly. Very importantly, we need to connect media campaigns. We need to have co-curricular activations or activities within schools, museums, libraries, and creating an affiliate network. Now, this is pulled from an Armenian model that ISWE has designed, where you are getting a large part of civil society and other organizations to follow the assembly, to listen in and to be a part of what's going on to increase public awareness, accountability, and also act on some of these initiatives. It's a quick stat. 70% of the population knew that the assembly was happening when the French Convention on Climate was happening. That's huge. We don't get that much percent of people knowing that it's election day or voting day. So very important that we have that moving forward in these processes. Fourth, assemblies should not only be institutionalized, but embedded into policy cycles. And this is something that we learned from NACA, or the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. There's a difference. Institutionalization is, yes, it's a permanent feature, part of government, but being embedded into government is actually making sure that it is connected to the agencies and it's connected to a policy cycle, and not just thinking that the policy recommendations, now that they're out and they're on a document, that they're going to go to something. They need to be more embedded into how government functions. And that, whether that's timing, whether that's bringing people on at different stages that are a part of other agencies that might be cross-disciplinary, that is a whole, design process in and of itself. But the difference between institutionalization and embedding is something to be focused on. And then lastly, we're looking at Assemblies can be vehicles to enable systems level impact or systems thinking. And I think this is something that we want to democratize. We don't want this to just be done at an elite level, but also, again, coming back to what I said earlier, allowing people to think on a systems level and that they have some agency on these large issues like climate change, migration, whatever it would be that are affecting us, that they can be a part of those too. Which now, we take all a collective deep breath. We can talk about an initiative that we're working on. So this is called Energize New York. I'm gonna bring us back to that quote that I talked about being a part of the process. But there's a part that I left off there. He says after this, in building systems games, you are starting to give people insights that they'll never get from a presentation. And nowadays that he teaches through games. So he's using games as a way to educate and learn about the systems that we're in. So I want to play a quick video about a game that we are utilizing and working with an organization called City Atlas.
Probably do the win card. It is something New York politicians have come to understand. If you want to successfully leave fossil fuels behind, you need to play your cards right. So is that a good idea for New York? Since January, these high schoolers at the Queen's School of Inquiry have been playing Energetic, a new board game that teaches students the complexities of decarbonizing New York's electrical grid by switching from fossil fuels to renewables.
So we're trying to have a sustainable energy source in New York by 2035, which is 16 gigawatts. And so far we have 3.
At a time when news of the climate emergency is demoralizing many kids and adults, Energetic wants to provide knowledge and tools so students feel they have a role to play in solving this crisis.
Playing these type of electricity games, it kind of opens up your mind to a different type of perspective.
Adam Zaid is a math teacher. Wind is expensive, right? And a member of the climate education leadership team.
So that's this game.
New York State has the goal of an electricity grid with 0 carbon emissions by 2040.
2025, and how many gigawatts do you have?
So the talent to be recruited for that mission might come from schools like this one.
I've always wanted to be an engineer, but I think because of this, it's going to be something based around the climate and creating sustainable energy that'll help our world.
So far,
Alrighty, so when watching that, I talked a little bit at the beginning around wanting myself to have this impact of finding a way to engage in these larger systems, both with my community, but also that's larger than me. And we found that this game could really do that. You've heard what the students said about how it's expanding their minds, how they even may switch their career path when looking forward. And I think if we're going to address this climate crisis that's really, it's coming or it's here, we gotta mobilize fast. So Energize New York is a grassroots initiative to scale deliberation and action to address the climate and ecological crisis facing New York. Right now, we are training, we will be training 100 facilitators. Right now, we have about 12 to 15 already in New York City that are trained. We are going to build 100 school ambassadors and our ambassador program to get 100 school ambassadors to be able to teach this game in schools, but as well as to teach about deliberation and deliberative democracy. An affiliate network that can actually keep the assembly accountable and building that ecosystem that we've been talking about. And then all of that being around an assembly. What if this was an activation tool that can allow the maxi public to be engaged within an assembly and follow it and put both the accountability measures for government to act on policies, but also be a part of the solutions within their community. Again, this is a huge collaborative project between the Democracy Innovation Hub and City Atlas. And this theory of change that I'm about to just go over quickly is from it's a collective wisdom from many people. Again, I will not take full credit for this at all. We've been discussing this over network calls and many different conversations. So again, I jumped into this movement thinking that a civic assembly was going to lead to government policy change, and that was the golden ticket. I was wrong and naive. And I think some of us might have also been as well. There's been other assemblies, though, that have done some public engagement before. There might have been some media coverage, like in the French Assembly on Climate, that leads to policy change, but also they can be watered down, like we saw in the French Climate Assembly. But my question is to ask, how might a civic assembly leverage the public infrastructure to energize the civic ecosystem for systems level impact? Or put another way, how might we go beyond the assembly? And so here we'll see that this is a model that we've been designing. And if you see there's 4 sections to it. The blue is a collaborative sense making. The yellow is collaborative direction setting. The purple is collaborative action. And then the most important part is this bottom part called collaborative will building. And so this is what I'm talking about, a more bottom-up movement for this initiative. I'm going to break these down quickly for what that could look like for Energize New York. So agenda setting can happen in a number of different ways. One of the big things that we think is important is the democratic process that elects the actual specific remit for the assembly. So let's give an example. If this was an all-youth assembly that was happening in New York City, couldn't the New York City Panel on Climate Change come up with the top 5 issues that perhaps there's some people within city government that are saying we could act on these issues as well? And then that gets put down to students across all of the DOE, which is Department of Education in New York City, universities, and they can vote on these top 5. What are the issues that they feel are the most important to actually discuss and make decisions on? That's a way of doing a democratic process. Again, this is a prototype, but it's a way of thinking about agenda setting from a mass and not just from an elite group. Next, we can look at the collaborative direction setting, or the assembly. We've talked about these a lot already. This could be from 150 to 500 assembly members. It could take, ideally, if we can get to that 90 hours, that'd be great, but we can't ask for everything. 30 to 90 hours of an assembly time. We know about the learning, deliberating, and decision-making that can go on. But ideally, there'd be site visits. We've been working with the New York City Botanical Gardens, which would be a fantastic place to host an assembly and to have students actually be a part of an ecosystem that is connected to the environment, not just in a room full of round tables, which are great, but let's get people in site visits and actually experiencing the world. Very importantly is the post-assembly committees. So this is something that has been happening about in different contexts, but I'm formalizing it a bit here. I'm suggesting, and we are suggesting, that there should be an agenda setting committee that sets the agenda for the next assembly, so this is not a one-off. There would be an accountability committee that can knock on the door of government to make sure that these recommendations are actually getting pushed through. A mass education committee that's actually working with a group of communication experts on what it actually should be communicated to the public of what happened in the assembly, of what are the recommendations and what the assembly believes and moves forward with. And lastly, collaborative ecosystem initiative. Now, this is something that is a bit different. How do we create a committee that is also pushing for recommendations that are not just asking government, but asking other actors in civil society to take action? And how can there be a committee that follows up through this? And now let's talk about the collaborative will building at the bottom. So we've talked about this before, getting this game into schools. There can be different forms of engagement. They can play the game. They can play the game and also have a curriculum that is built in with this. And then they can also have doing curriculum and doing a project that is also related to assembly, whether it be energy, food systems, et cetera. Different avenues for different types of engagement. Public forums, these can be held at libraries and museums and cultural institutions where they can connect and give their ideas about the assembly, being a part of it, and also watching the assembly as it happens, the learning process, so that they can deliberate themselves, again, connecting to the maxi public. There's been a few different examples of this, but what if an assembly that happened on climate, what if we had immersive exhibits that were happening in our museums and our public spaces, so people can actually not abstractly be talking about an issue, but really try to wrestle with it in different embodied forms of learning. Importantly, an affiliate network, so building up 25 civil society organizations. We already have partners at Barnard, at Columbia, at CUNY, and many high schools that have already been playing this game, but building that up so that they can be a part and create the political will that we need to pass some of these policies. And so that is the model. So the last thing. So government policy, we know that we want some of these policy changes to happen, but it's really this affiliate network and this collaborative ecosystem model that will create the political will needed to pass the different recommendations that we see put forward. And importantly, this last point, residents have a pathway to engage in affecting systematic change. Again, what I started with and what's something I kind of yearned for as a child. This is a much more complex model that we do not want to show you that, but that is something that's been made that condenses everything that I just talked about. I'm going to leave you on this quote and really ask y'all to think, when we're thinking about assemblies, how do we democratize systems thinking? How do we get people to not just think about these recommendations, but also engage with them? And how do we get the maxi public involved? Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Yes, maybe Kosmatakos. Maybe it's not the right thing to ask the first question, but can I take the devil's advocate here approach? It seems that in all those cases they work very well, but we're testing a decision method on good times. How about how would perform in bad times? I mean, voting or representative democracy or, referenda ensure us that, we have a good context of making a decision or a very toxic and very polarized context. My experience of this type of self-emerging assemblies in Greece in 2010, in 2011, do you know what spread? Rampant anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories. You had a minority of 20-25% of Greeks who are very anti-Semitic and very into conspiracy theories, and in those assemblies, after all, you would see rampant anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories spreading, that politicians would try to explain, no, we have to pay some of our debts back, even if it's not fully, and they say, no, there is hidden money stashed over there, and we know who has it. I was so thankful we had elites and experts who buggered themselves in the parliament and voted with 2/3 majority to get the bloody money from the Germans and not become like Albania, no offense to the country, right? And so I can see how this works positively. And actually, my whole school experience from my kid is exactly that's the way of doing it. But do we want to ask a real question, not a statement? What type of safety pins do we want to this mechanism to exist? Or what are the contexts or what are the conditions that ensure that we're not throwing this into toxic or polarized contexts and you have unintended consequences? So that's the question. Forget the statement.
That is a great question, but I also see another hand. Do you want to jump onto that? Okay, great. My quick question answer to this, and we were talking about a little bit last night, is that there's a dichotomy when we think about bottom up, top down. And it already seems adversarial when we're thinking about that. And I think we need to vanish that a bit, and we need to think about how can governance, not government, governance, be collaborative? How can the process of creating the agenda be collaborative? I wouldn't want just students to come up with the agenda solely. I would want them to be informed and learned about what's going on, but also be able to speak from their lived experience. So I think it's a collaborative process between those that aren't in political power or in financial power with those in government to be able to actually come up with this, or scientists, like I said, the New York City Civic panel on climate change coming up with this. So my quick answer to that, and throughout this whole assembly, the standards that are coming out of all the assemblies that usually are coming through government processes, I think should still be into play. We are just expanding the agenda setting to be more democratized, and we're also making sure that the support for the assembly and the things that are going on the assembly are being followed and watched by an affiliate network of collaborators. So it's not just, I do see government playing a role. I don't know if they're the full initiators of this. I see them being collaborative in this. But the important, very important question. We had a question over, a couple questions.
Two fingers on this, because I think that causes something, and I think that your answer started to address the point of how to avoid essentially capture within the deliberative process. But you said something that is very interesting, but too briefly. The assembly proceedings are being watched by whom? Like, it seems to me that in the watching, you are inserting an element of mutual monitoring or monitoring of some sort that is actually preventing that capture process from taking place. So can you speak just a little bit more about that?
Yes, it shouldn't. I do never see the assembly, the actual conversations being recorded. The idea is for the actual lectures, the actual experiences, if they go on a nature walk in the botanical gardens, these experiences and the lectures would be recorded so that small groups at a library can then discuss about them. But what the citizens are actually discussing in their small tables would never be broadcasted, so it doesn't create that perception of being watched and self-censoring.
I think actually my question is tangential, but I think related. It's also about just and Chris rose by Meta, or with Meta, by the way. The question I think is that I would love to just hear your reflection on is throughout your comments, and I think that this is logical, is more public awareness about what's happening through an assembly. And you gave the example of the French example. Is a good thing because it builds legitimacy or credibility or awareness about this type of decision making or governance mechanism. Is there any risk in your mind about like creating an ecosystem where, because there's greater awareness, there's efforts to lobby or jockey or essentially to create like an analogy to representative democracy where people are lobbying members of the assembly? And I guess, like, how do you balance that tension? Because then you risk replicating some of the same risks with representative democracy.
Yeah, so one of the things that should be clear is that the representatives during a process should never be shared of who's in it, and maybe afterwards they can be shared. But there also has been examples, I can't pull them off the top of my head where this has actually happened. And one of them, they came and reported it to the assembly, and because of the collective cohesion they were already making, they're like, no, we believe in this process. But that's not to say that in the future that this could happen. I think that is a problem that we should be thinking about as these start to scale and expand. But I mean, the first way forward is not exposing who's in the assemblies is really important. But I think that's important to think about, and I think there has been probably some people within this field already addressing these types of issues. Because we're so new to this in the States, I'm still trying to get the ideas out with really simple diagrams, so it's not there. But totally agreed. I think that's an important issue that we have to keep thinking about. Okay. And also, I would like to open up if people have a good answer to that as well, because I felt like I gave a partial answer. But if someone has thought about this, please speak.
And we can talk a bit more at the panel. I'm going to take the last question, and then we'll convene for lunch. Two brief comments. Also, this game is active learning, is what we would call it from the academic side. And there's a lot of funding, a lot of interest, and a lot of stuff around active learning and kind of trying to make like learning more dynamic. You don't use that language, but we do. So this is a great kind of initiative. Also, since I was harping on selection earlier, I liked your point about having a robust media communications arm, because if you actually do that before and you can get more people than just like the tails, the dissidents and the activists involved, you might actually solve the selection effect. But my question is about budget. So these things are so expensive to run. Like if you want to do like an academic study where you're trying to like do a citizens assembly, and a lot of the collaborative, governments can fund it, NGOs can fund it, you can find kind of private organizations, but it's a real like constraint. And so how do you deal with that? Like, is there, like, especially from the practitioner side, is it just, you find enough partners to have 20 hours when you want 90 hours? Or like, when do the budgeting trade-offs really come home? And is there kind of a government cap if you're trying to like integrate more local governments? Like, do they say, hey, we'd love to do this, but it's just so expensive, we can't do it? Like, what's your practitioner experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think when working with the Civic Engagement Commission, which again was different than this initiative, it's part of this is seeing is believing, right? After the second process, they've increased the hours and the amount of time. But this was new. I remember one of the comments was like, no resident is gonna want to be in this many meetings for this long. And at the end, what did everybody ask for? More time. So part of it is being a part of the process. As far as budgeting goes, I think the one nice aspect to this model is that we're not just asking government to pay for this. It's a civic ecosystem. So where funding comes, I think, is a bit more open. Ideally, we want this to be I've been calling it a series rather than permanence because I think the US isn't ready for that. I think it's still a new idea, but a series actually gives you time to really iterate on and learn from how you're doing it, and also for it to get into the public psyche a bit more so they can understand this. It's not just a one-off. So, finding that funding, it's not just directly going through one source. I think because we've been doing so much work to be able to build the civic ecosystem, and big kudos to Phil for really establishing this both in the US and in New York, is that we can tap now on some of these people. Oh God, I said tap, didn't I? Okay, I gotta be careful with that. Sometimes I throw that in without knowing. Anyways.
Benefit from the support of.
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks.